with us. We're almost there. Don't worry. So I'm Spencer Jones. This is Carson Stones and Dustin Stevenson Reynolds. We're the energy team. So we'll guide you through the last part here. We're almost there. So just to start with, this is a picture of a pilot CCS project. Travis referred to it earlier. Not the specific project, but it's in China, which kind of is the story of our presentation, China and the U.S. So energy production to us considers everything from the mining and the extraction of the fuel source to the actual production of the fuel into electricity, so into the wall outlet that we all enjoy the reliability of. So today, the IEA in 2009 estimated that by the year 2050, total annual reductions for that kind of coveted 2-degree scenario warming, energy production will account for about 55% of all of those worldwide emissions in the year 2050. And the top 5 emitters in this sector constitute about 17 gigatons CO2 of that 2030. So substantial percentage. And these top 5 are, of course, China, the US, India, Russia, and the European Union. So our key findings, as much as we'd like it to go away, coal will persist. It's cheap, it's easy, it's available. Renewables have strong potentials, but there are challenges with the cheapness of coal and the kind of the regulatory environment that can inhibit it, the proliferation of renewables. And if the shale gas revolution is going to be copied anywhere, it needs help to take off. To start with, our solutions. So for coal, we propose a combination of high efficiency, low emissions generation coal plants, kind of as a bridge to eventually adopting CCS and hopefully a commercially feasible application that would lower the cost. So right now the cost is we'll get to that in a little bit, is quite challenging. With renewables, of course, we're going to recommend a continued development of renewables portfolios across the world. And then with fuel switching, we have a few kind of key policy levers that would help encourage the switch towards natural gas, away from coal, which isn't, the save-all kind of panacea, but it is much less carbon intensive than coal. Okay, just to start with, give you some visual. These graphs are going to show you on the same scale. On the left axis is the electricity generation of the countries from 2001 to 2011. On the right axis with the dotted line is the emissions estimate in megatons CO2. The key here is the distribution of the source of electricity generation. You can see in China the story's coal. I mean, it's got some hydro potential, substantial hydro, but coal is going to be the story, and it still has been in the last 10 years. This is the U.S., so the picture's a little different, a little bit more varied, but coal is still a substantial part, with a little dip during the recession, but you can kind of see the common theme here. Coal, you'd expect the EU to have a little bit more diversity than the U.S., of course, with lower emissions, but the key thing to notice here is basically flat, and almost in the U.S., basically flat overall. We're not anticipating much change in that generation pattern, and also the same for Russia. So these are our top 5 countries, but there's significant differences because they're all on the same scale. You can kind of see the scope of differences across the world and the importance of China, the U.S., and Europe, basically. One more story here is the potential for India. Today, I mean, their coal dependence is very much visible, but if they grow anywhere nearly as fast as China has, we'd expect a similar story to what we've seen with respect to coal. So that's why we think they're important to include in the mix. So as I referenced before, Healy plants and CCS are both expensive. So just to give you some numbers here, with CCS, the process costs about 15 to 20% extra coal to actually provide the power to power the process. So it's an energy penalty essentially, which makes it more expensive. It makes it more iffy on air quality and air pollution. So it may not be kind of the panacea that everyone hopes it would be. And as we mentioned before, coal's cheap, coal's easy, and particularly in the developing world, in China and India, there's a lack of maybe administrative capacity and regulatory environment around sort of land use, land administration, environmental monitoring that is needed for this sort of technology to take off with respect to liability, treatment of the environment around the sites, finding the suitable site to store the CO2 underground, So there's kind of a lot of uncertainty that would kind of deter investment. With Healy, we have, let's see. Yeah. So Healy is, this kind of there's 3 different types. It's basically everything that each tier is a more efficient, higher pressure, higher heat combustion of coal, which yields you less carbon per unit of electricity that you can generate. The problem there is that it's expensive, but the good news is that 50% of new 50% of new coal plants worldwide are implemented at least supercritical, which there's supercritical, ultra supercritical, and advanced ultra supercritical. So each of those is more expensive metals, and kind of still under development. But the bad news on Healy is today, the existing stock of coal plants, 75% are below that supercritical. So we still got a lot of work to do on that for the bridge technology to get going. And so I think our solutions, if I went too far. So we're going to basically propose that there be better financing for these Healy projects and towards the long-term potential of CCS. Stricter environmental standards, and the U.S. has been good about this with our natural gas phenomenon that's come about. It's easier to get off of coal because of the lower carbon alternative. And we're still hanging in there for hopes for CCS. It's not commercially feasible yet, but there are pilot projects primarily in the US and China that are on the way. So I'm going to turn it over to Dustin for talk on renewables.
All right, so I'm just going to talk a bit about the barriers to the diffusion of renewable technologies in the top 5 emitters. The first thing that you commonly hear about or that people talk about as a significant barrier to the diffusion of renewables is the cost, right? And it really depends a lot on it depends on the extent of the domestic industry that produces renewable technologies, and it also depends on the country's openness to trade as well. So those are large determinants of the cost. But broadly speaking, in many cases, certain renewable technologies, for example, hydropower and geothermal, are already cost competitive with fossil fuel sources. Look, from a global perspective, though, the main obstacle is how this cost is distributed. So, for example, the levelized cost of electricity is the cost of a renewable technology over its lifetime as an energy producer. The problem is that the costs are very high. They're very high upfront costs. A second sort of problem is this technical capacity. So you have in developing countries, India, for example, or as well in China, they do require certain maintenance and upkeep as well, and so so yes, it may require some sort of like creative thinking about training programs in order to maintain the renewables. I'll move on next to just market structures. So in certain cases, market structures themselves might hinder the deployment of renewable technologies. So for example, in China, the way electricity is sort of traded between regions, they use these very long-term sort of contracts that lock in the sale of electricity at a certain price. And what that means is that even if one region develops renewable capacity and has excess electricity they can sell, they're locked into selling at a very low or a price agreed on far in the past. So that kind of discourages incentives for investment in renewable technologies. And then a final barrier would be related to protectionism. And so you have certain countries that have domestic content requirements. So for example, India has domestic content requirements. They don't have much of a renewable energy, like a domestic production of that, and so in India, costs are artificially high because of these content requirements in their. So for from a policy perspective, either opening up for trade or reducing these domestic content requirements might reduce some of these cost issues. Okay, so then this is just a few of the broad sort of solutions or recommendations that come from this, and there are kind of more, but I just kind of picked sort of a handful. The first one kind of, Renewables are a very important part of this, but it ties in with the broader energy production sector. And so the EU should work toward better coordinating like national subsidy programs with the broader ETS systems. The ETS is a EU level market mechanism and then there's a plethora of like sort of national level subsidy and incentive programs. Chinese government should relax rigid electricity market structures that reduce incentives to invest in renewable technologies. I explained that on the previous slide. And the Indian government should attempt to better align existing policies, and I can discuss that more in the question and answer section if you would like. So now I'll hand it to Carson.
All right, so we're going to finish today by talking about natural gas and a macro trend that's been going on in the United States for the last decade and a half, just about. So the reason I'm going to focus on the United States rather than Japan, the EU, and other countries is that this is primarily driven by price. So the reason that fuel switching occurs in the United States, I will explain in detail why that's occurred, but price at $4 or under $4 per million cubic feet is a really big deal. In Japan, light natural gas is being imported largely from Qatar, and in the EU, they're importing largely from Russia. So the other part of this is, I'll actually stay on here for a second. The other part of this is going to be regulation within the United States. So we have what's called MATS, the Mercury and Air Toxic Standards, which are issued by the EPA. And these have driven utilities to decide, do I want to upgrade my existing coal plants to meet these standards, or do I want to invest in something else instead? So the way that electricity is purchased is that you purchase based on the marginal cost of your existing fleet of power plants. And this is determined by fuel cost. So if your fuel cost is low here, and you have and it's cheaper to burn natural gas than it is to burn coal, you're going to burn natural gas. Now, where this gets interesting is two other key pieces of legislation which are under the Clean Air Act. This is Section B and Section D. These determine what is going to happen when the old coal plants are retired and what is going to be built in their place. So the coal plants in the United States, the ones that have been retired, and there have been many retirements lately, 58 last year, 22 gigawatts of capacity, are largely driven by meeting these new standards and being too expensive. So when they're phased out, they're phasing out old, over 50 years. They're phasing out inefficient. These are the plants that only have a capacity factor, meaning they run and generate electricity for the grid 33% of the time. And they are primarily small, less than 100 megawatt plants. So this is a trend which is going to continue, the EIA estimates, through 2016 when these new MAT standards are finally implemented. So right now the industry is adjusting to this. There's an abundance of shale gas in the United States, which is ultimately driving these low prices. And the future of the U.S. energy grid is going to phase out old plants and build new plants. So the question becomes, what is going to happen with the price of natural gas? So shale gas is largely produced by two innovations, hydraulic fracturing and horizontal drilling. These have significant environmental concerns associated with them. They range from seismicity to groundwater issues, surface water especially. What do you do with the wastewater that's injected and then pulled out? Where does it go? Is our current infrastructure able to accommodate that? Boomtown effects. What happens to the small towns where the drilling rigs roll in, they tear up the roads, there's a lot of noise, and other environmental effects. So depending on the extent of this boom and how long it lasts and how long the price stays low, that's ultimately going to determine the fuel mix in the United States. The other issue is that the Clean Air Act, Section 111D, is in the White House Budget Office right now. The MAT standards have passed judicial muster, and the Supreme Court will decide in June. The Section 111D is for new plant emission standards. So if you're a utility and you want to build a new generation plant, then you have to decide for baseload power what is the EPA ultimately going to determine? And more importantly, what are the states who have to implement these policies going to do in my unique state? So you have a lot of different players and a lot of different, there's a lot of cost calculus going on, and thus there's a lot of uncertainty moving forward. So our solutions are that in the US, we can control emissions through encouraging, through the EPA, the retirement of our existing out-of-date, inefficient coal fleet and phasing in instead renewables, natural gas, nuclear power. Then in China and India, where they possess abundant shale gas, China, I think I read just the other day actually, drilled their first commercially viable hydraulic fracturing well. So I think there was a fireball of some kind associated with that. It's going to be stop and start. The shale gas in China, unfortunately, is much deeper. It's harder to get to and thus more dangerous. The land tenure system is different, so the profit mechanism is not the same as in the United States. This is the big question mark for shale gas around the world. India also possesses very large shale gas. If they are going to displace their coal fleets, like we've seen in the United States, based upon price and regulation, then they will need to exploit this shale gas. Now, accommodating that is infrastructure. If you do not have the pipeline infrastructure in place already, it's going to be very hard. And in the US, we even have this problem where we flare. If the pipelines don't reach from where the urban centers are out to North Dakota or the Bakken Shale in South Texas, it's not profitable to get to hold on to that natural gas, and it can even be dangerous. It can explode on you if you're not careful. So they flare it into the atmosphere, which is another environmental effect. India and China will have to address these issues if they do want to develop their shale gas reserves. Finally, the EU member states, they have abundant natural gas as well. They have decided to, at least in Germany, phase out nuclear power. They are still reliant on baseload power. Like the US, though, their electricity generation has stagnated, which is based upon demand and increasing energy efficiency. However, if they do end up phasing out all of their nuclear, they're going to either rely on coal or natural gas. If they say no to natural gas, that leaves them with coal and renewables. So if the renewables can catch up, that's fantastic. If they cannot, it's going to be very difficult. And right now, like I said, they import their gas largely from Russia. So that's the end of our presentation. Yeah.